thank you for honoring me with an invitation tonight. I have been to many tea events. I know they are filled with intelligence, information, curiosity. And I'm going to tell you right now that my topic tonight is fairly new to me as well. And so that's why I have a few cheat sheets up here. It is so good to be back in Quincy and see some of these faces I haven't seen for a long, long time. Most of you, many of you at least, know my husband, Chuck McClurg. He sent his special regards and warm wishes for a really nice Christmas for every one of you. Now, you may be wondering, what's old Andrea been doing for the last 5 years? Well, first of all, I discovered a passion for gardening, and I now know what a true addiction is like to experience. And I kind of wish you could have been there in 2007 or so, or maybe I don't, because we were wrenching shrubbery stumps out of the ground and saying, "The head of Phil Hare!" And while that isn't nice, we have the most beautiful garden now, and it was the cheapest therapy you could possibly have. Chuck also wanted me to bring you this picture. It's a picture of pigeons all looking expectant. I bet you've seen it. The crowd waits in eager anticipation for the unveiling of the new Obama statue. Pigeons, think about it. Okay, well, my talk tonight is to acquaint you with Agenda 21. And I want to start with a disclaimer that I cannot prove that everything that has been happening to me with and by city governments has to do with Agenda 21, but it might. Now, the primary thing, you know, the gardening has been a fun vocation, but the primary thing I've been doing for the last few years is buying rental properties, renovating them, and then renting them out. So we have a holding company and we have investment properties in 4 states. Well, I've been dealing with the city government, and that's been very interesting. Agenda 21 basically is an encroachment on our American rights, and it is property rights, among others. So is what I'm experiencing related to Agenda 21? I can't say that it is, but I do know that Agenda 21's trickle-down effect is really huge. I got interested in managing rentals because my parents did it. I try to keep my properties nice, and I try to rent to nice people. Well, when my mother died, she left me 3 properties in Macomb, right up your fabulous 336 here. And no, not much after she had died, they instituted a rental inspection. And in order to pay for the rental inspection, they charged the landlords, of course. Now, it was my thought at the time that my mama would not have liked that very much. And that was my first inkling back in 2001 that property ownership was getting somewhat more regulated than we had been accustomed to over the past 20 years or so of owning rentals. Well, the first time I remember being incensed was when I had lived in a house in a Quad City community, and then I got married, but I kept the house to rent it out. The stove went bad. The city was very good about trash collection, always did it free. I called them up. I said, "I need you to pick up a stove." She said, "You don't live there anymore, do you?" I said, "No." She said, "That'll be $25. I said, "Wait, I still own the house. I still pay the property taxes. What's the difference?" She said, "Well, you're making money." Now, I chalk that up to living in Rock Island County, where we've had a Democrat regime for decades now, and that's kind of their attitude. We call it Little Crook County because it's been so Democratic, but I have to stand here tonight and tell you that is changing, as you know, because you helped get Bobby Schilling elected, for one thing. Thank you for that. Well, meanwhile, Macomb was charging me these rental inspection fees, $90 a year. They inspected once in 2004. They made me put in an egress window. I said, "What, the firemen are too fat to get, in and out?" They didn't like that. And I really should keep my mouth shut more often. But so anyway, I've been paying these fees since 2001. I've been inspected once, and I think they've been through 7 rental inspectors. Well, then came the day they decided to mandate that one house in particular had to have private trash collection because the city had passed an ordinance that said 3 or more units required private trash collection. Now there are 4 people in this house. You know, that's maybe as many or more, slightly more maybe than the average family. And so I called up the city and I said, does this mean you're going to not charge me the trash collection part of the water bill? No, it did not mean that, and so I am paying twice now for trash collection, once through the city and once privately. So let's talk about Agenda 21. Agenda 21 encroaches on lots of American rights, including property rights, and we have to go back to what Agenda 21 is. For starters, it's boring. It is very, very dull. And because of that, Americans have no idea what it is, nor do they care, and this is how the encroachment has begun. For another thing, Agenda 21 is a United Nations plan. Its goal is control. Simple as that. Its goal is control. Now, let me put it like the Heritage Foundation put it recently, and I think some of you have already seen this article. They said, ready to trade your car for a bike, or maybe a subway ride, interested in fewer choices for a home, paying more for housing, and being crammed into a denser neighborhood, you can have all this and more if radical environmentalists and smart growth advocates have their way and local, state, and federal governments impose the policies set forth in the United Nations Agenda 21. Agenda 21 was born almost 20 years ago in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Now, Agenda 21 apparently, nobody's really sure, but it apparently means agenda for the 21st century. The stated goal is sustainability. Quick, put up your hands and define sustainability. It's real tough, and it's real vague. As Wiki puts it, I looked on Wiki, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now this sounds good, sounds lofty, sounds noble. But to do that, Agenda 21 promotes socialist goals that are more European than they are American. And it looks at private land ownership as inferior to public land ownership for the good of the many. Now, if this sounds to you like socialism, Marxism, communism, well, yeah. Now, good luck finding an elected official who has had more than a passing acquaintance with Agenda 21. I have to tell you, as a congressional candidate, I heard about issues I didn't know existed, but I do not recall ever hearing about Agenda 21. It's non-binding. It's not a threat in and of itself. The threat is how it is worming its way into our smallest communities. And here are several ways that's happening. Number one, through our presidents. H.W. Bush signed Agenda 21, signed off on it at Rio in 1992. President Clinton lost no time in setting up the President's Council on Sustainable Development, taking Agenda 21 to our towns and cities. And this past June, when everybody was thinking about Osama bin Laden, Mr. Obama created the White House Council on Rural America, bringing Agenda 21 into our rural communities. Second way, both those councils came about through executive order, and we know all about that. That bypasses the Congress and the courts. Congress has never had anything to do with Agenda 21. They've never approved it. They've never considered it. No. Why work through legislation if you can work other ways, right? So, they've bypassed the Congress and the courts. There is a soft approach to our cities and small towns through something called the ICLEI. This is the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. And listen to this, folks. So far, 6,000 American cities and towns belong to this huge consortium. You can Google it, and you can see that none of the cities in which I own property is a member, which was comforting to me. But Rock Island belongs, surprise. Peoria belongs, Springfield belongs, and of course, Chicago belongs. Yet HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, works closely with the ICLEI, and HUD's 2,000-page legislative land use guidebook is in use by many, many local governing bodies. So, Agenda 21 happens not through legislation, but through regulation, that word we all love so much. And none of this regulation appears to be authorized by the U.S. Constitution. Agenda 21 has been called a huge and illegal land grab. Now, I'm going to read to you a chilling quote that I came across. You remember that Biosphere project that they set up out west? That was a voluntary project with the United Nations. On page 15 of the published Wildlands Project, it states, "We must convert at least 50% of the land area of North America to wilderness, off limits to human beings." Oh, you laugh. Then, these core areas of wilderness are to be interconnected by wilderness corridors, off limits to human beings. These, it gets better, folks. These will be surrounded by buffer zones with limited resource use, under the supervision and permitting of the federal government, in collaboration with non-governmental organizations. The human population is to be resettled in the remaining 25% of land into communities described as sustainable communities. Now, if this sounds to you like the latest dark, futuristic movie plot, let me tell you that as of this moment, 40% of the land in the United States is owned by governments, local, state, and federal. And finally, as the last way in which I know about Agenda 21 works, it's through the carrot on the stick, and that is grants. Because just like with the carrot, the grant comes with strings attached. There are so many fingers when you start researching Agenda 21, so many fingers, it's like the legs on a centipede. It's reaching into American energy programs, education, farm management, food standards, health care. The list is pretty dazzling. I want to tell you about a couple of websites real quickly before I start winding down here. Freedom21.org is recommended by the experts on property rights I'm going to tell you about in just a minute. Freedom21.org. And the other one is called Morph like morphing, morph.com, where there's a lexicon of Agenda 21, which is really cool also. Catchphrases and words that alert us to its presence. Two biggies. I want you to remember this if you don't remember anything else tonight, are anything with the word sustainable in it. Sustainable, sustain, sustainability. And number two is anything with the word smart attached. Smart growth, smart grid, smart meters, smart. Then there are the 3 E's of Agenda 21, and those are environment or ecology, economy, and social equality. Now, you may have also caught that reference to non-governmental organizations. Those are called NGOs. And that acronym, like the phrase land use, should put up red flags whenever you hear either one of them. Well, my growing knowledge of Agenda 21 has kind of neatly and chronologically paralleled my growing bumping up against city governments in this business of my investments. Macomb is currently insisting I replace an old roof on an old garage. The roof is newer than the garage is. It doesn't leak, it doesn't show daylight, it isn't coming off, it isn't dangerous, but it doesn't look nice. Now, the only person who can see this roof is the tenant when she's on the second floor in the bathroom and she's told me she could care less. So the rental inspector said, well, doesn't matter, just apply for a waiver, which I did. I went to the trouble to apply for a waiver. It was denied. I have to put the roof on. In Sycamore, Illinois, we let the city building inspector, we had to do this, I sure tried hard not to, but through a long story, we had to let the city building inspector into a basement apartment we were trying to create in a finished basement. Well, the young, new, handsome, tall city inspector, or building inspector came, and so did the older, ugly, short guy who was now the new electrical inspector because he had wanted to be the building inspector, but they gave it to the handsome fellow instead. And so they came every time in separate city vehicles, identical vehicles, but they came in two of them. And by the time they were done, we had taken the drop ceiling out. We had ruined all the paneling because they mandated 6 receptacles in 2 walls. We had to have a frame for the new ceiling. The electrical inspector said no. The building inspector said yes. So he was the more superior. So we had to do the frame, and that's gone on and on. I had my eye on a house in Haines City, Florida. It was great. It was a foreclosure. I suddenly realized I didn't have a prayer because it was a neighborhood revitalization house, and when I looked that up, I realized that there was no way I was going to get my hands on it because it probably went to the friend of the city administrator who was handling the federal money that was neighborhood revitalization. And tell me this, why does a community that is gated with 24-hour security and has the 6th best golf course in Florida need revitalizing? But that's where the federal money went. In DeWitt, Iowa, I had to get a permit. Now, you guys, I bet a lot of you fellows have been around this, and maybe you will say, well, there's good reason you're not, being persecuted. It's just everywhere. That's the thing. It's pervasive. I had to get a permit in DeWitt, Iowa to build a shed, even though they said, well, we'll just do it through the mail, and they knew that the shed would be up and painted before I ever got the permit, and they got it back. So I'm thinking, so what's this permit for? In Sycamore, every electrician has to be licensed in Sycamore. It doesn't matter if you're licensed, 4 other communities. You have to be licensed in Sycamore. And I had to have a building permit in order to put the new ceiling in the basement. I've heard of people having to have building permits because they were changing out their water heater. My carpenter in Sycamore has rental property in Elgin. He warned me away from it. He says it's impossible now. It's an ICLEI city. The electrician lives in Carpentersville. Too bad the carpenter doesn't live in Carpentersville. But the electrician lives in Carpentersville and says, I love my town. I love my neighborhood. I love my house. But I'd leave in a minute because every time I have a job to do, I got to go hassle with City Hall. Now, these are good men. They know their craft, they're fair, they work hard for their money. I myself am proud that over the last 11 years, in my own small way, I've created jobs, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, lawyers, realtors. And yet, I keep thinking, is this really the American way? Did you know that in the Chicago area, as a plumber or an electrician, you can work in Chicago or outside of Chicago, but not both? It's because of mutually exclusive permitting, because permitting is such a lucrative business. And Chicago said, well, you collared people can't work in Chicago. And so the collared people said, well, fine, then you can't work in the collars. So, this is not the American way. What would our founding fathers say? Benjamin Franklin was a huge property owner. What would he say? What would the pioneers say? What would all the entrepreneurs who built this country on individual initiative and free enterprise say? I'm going to close with the slogan of the UCLG. This is United Cities and Local Governments. Another Agenda 21 spinoff. They're headquartered in Barcelona, Spain, but if you doubt that they reach into America's small towns, the mayor of Bluffton, Indiana is the treasurer for the UCLG. Anyway, I love this. Listen to this very closely. The UCLG bills itself as the united voice and world advocate of democratic local self-government. Now, is that an oxymoron, or is that just ominous? And am I coming under the influence of Agenda 21 or not? I don't know. In closing, the good news is we have an Agenda 21 expert in Jersey County. Her name is Joyce Morrison. A lot of you know her. She has written extensively and on the radio about this topic. She, would be happy to help any of you with more information. And the go-to guy for Glenn Beck, the wise man on property rights, is Henry Lamb. You'll hear that name some, Mr. Henry Lamb. Now, I have handouts here because I got so enamored of the quotes I came across in the story they told about Agenda 21. Unfortunately, my husband's printer and my printer both ran out of ink at almost the same moment last night. So I made 5 copies. Think of them like a colonial newspaper, and pass them around if you're interested, or make copies of your own. But thank you so much for having me here tonight. Such a pleasure to see so many familiar and